We take a look at the Minnesota Wild, their offseason moves, and how much is Kirill Kaprizov going to get paid, and more on this offseason edition of Locked On NHL Game Night.
When that final horn sounds, you know it's time for Locked On NHL Game Night. All the post-game reactions to every game across the league, every single night, with insights only the hosts at Locked On can provide. Prepare to experience game day reactions like never before. Only on Locked On NHL Game Night. Your team every day.
Hey, hockey fans, welcome to Locked On NHL Game Night, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your teams every day. Thanks for making Locked On NHL Game Night your place to get a recap of the night in the NHL during the regular season and playoffs. We are available wherever you're getting your shows on podcasts and on YouTube. Today's episode brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. I'm Eddie Garcia, an LA Kings fan on the West Coast. He is Shukri Wrights, a Boston Bruins fan on the East Coast. Together, we're normally discussing all the goals, saves, big moments, and stories from the night in the NHL. But of course, it's the offseason. There are no games to recap, but we are here to help you get ready for next season by previewing all 32 NHL teams between now and opening night. And we're going to be bringing in one of our local experts to help us out tonight. Shu, we're going to be talking and learning more about what's been going on in the state of hockey with the Minnesota Wild.
It's about to be wild this episode, but guess what? I'm all for it because after all, the Minnesota Wild are in an interesting state of mind going into 2025-2026 season. And listen, I can't wait for our buddy Seth to join us and to get knee deep into wild hockey, into the wilderness. That is wild hockey in Minnesota.
Well, let us waste no more time and welcome in the host of Locked On Minnesota Wild. He is Seth Toupal. He's going to give us his insights onto the team he covers on a daily basis. Seth, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Gentlemen, it's my pleasure to bring you a little insight into the Minnesota Wild here as the offseason rolls on because, like you said, it is an interesting point for the Minnesota Wild. Some big decisions that have yet to be made, and a team that is really hungry to, for the first time in over 10 years, first time getting out of the first round. I would love for that to happen here this season, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, well, before we smile, like just real quick, like when you came on, Seth, and that just made me warm and fuzzy on a nice summer day. Like, oh my God, I'm like, yeah. There's like a loaded smile there, and it was just perfect.
Well, before we get into the offseason and look ahead towards next season, we do want to take a quick look back. Minnesota Wild last year, 97 points, fourth in the Central. They did make the playoffs. Fifth time in the last 6 seasons they qualified for the postseason, but did lose a tough one to Vegas in 6 games in the first round. Seth, from the expectations going into last season to where things ended up, what's the feeling like with the Minnesota Wild?
Well, I think people expected that it would be a better year than a couple of seasons ago where the Wild missed out by a handful of points on the postseason. I don't think anybody expected that this team would be alone at the top as far as points go in December. Got off to a great start. And with Kirill Kaprizov having a Hart Trophy type season, the Wild looked pretty good through the early part of December, and then the injuries hit. And for a while, it was, I don't know how many thought truly that it was slipping away, but it came down to the final day to make the postseason, and the Wild inevitably did. But just once the injuries hit, it just kind of took away the dynamic of a team that was getting great goaltending. They were playing great defense, but they had a guy who was on the short list of best players in the league that was just going on a wrecking tour. And Kaprizov was doing some things that we hadn't seen from him, which is crazy considering what we have seen from him in his career so far. But they weren't quite able to get back to that level as the season wore on. And then against Vegas, they get off to the good start, and it just kind of fizzled. And Vegas woke up and took care of the Wild in 6. And now we finally get to stop saying the names Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. The cap hits have gone down to strictly the buyouts, which creates a nice level of financial flexibility for this team. And it is a team that I think is poised to be big players in the trade deadline, in making a move to bolster this roster now that they finally have the resources to do it. Free agency, they were involved in a few people, but it feels like a big trade during the season is going to be the way they put themselves on the map. And they're expecting to do exactly what they did in the beginning of the season last year, just with a little less freakish injury bad luck.
So my question to you is this. I think about what the Minnesota Wild, what they're able to do this past season. And I like what I saw from some of the young players like Brock Faber, Matt Boldy, and Marco Rossi as the young players on the roster who have really worked on cementing themselves as being a vital part of the Minnesota Wild's future. We know that Brock Faber is certainly going to be part of the Wild's future. You know what, Matt Boldy is going to be there long-term potentially. But there seemed to be a little bit of doubt in regards to Marco Rossi. And my question to you is, like, do you believe that Marco Rossi will fit as part of the long-term plans for the Minnesota Wild? And if not, why not?
Well, I think the Wild would love for him to be part of the long-term future for this team at their number.
Mhm.
And it's pretty clear that his camp has a different number in mind. And the fact that both sides there has not been a lot of progress made to try to kind of bridge that gap and put together a long-term contract, which I think tells you that there is a pretty substantial difference between what the Wild think he's worth and what he thinks he's worth himself. But at the same time, I can't really fault Rossi for wanting to get a deal comparable to what other players in similar age brackets have gotten all offseason. Like, that's just the going rate for that type of player. And a guy who had over 20 goals the last 2 seasons. He's played every game the last 2 seasons. He has become a critical fixture for this team. I do applaud Bill Guerin for not, training him just to be done with it, so to speak. But at the same time, it just does feel like there may come a point where they finally get something done for this season, but it does not feel like he is going to be somebody that's on this roster for long. The biggest thing comes down to his size, which is nothing he can do about. Bill Guerin just likes a larger center on his roster. Joel Eriksson is like his prototypical center. And the fact that Rossi is 5'9", 5'10", that is seen as kind of a downside to what he brings to the table. So it has drawn out much longer than I thought it was going to. And unfortunately, it does not show any signs of resolution here in the short term.
Seth, I did want to ask you again about the way the season ended and what is the feeling, if you can speak for the fan base or for the organization. I know me as an LA Kings fan, we know about first round playoff exits as well. We have not been out of the first round since winning the cup in 2014. And there's a feeling for the Kings that we blew it this year. We had a 2-0 series lead. We had leads in games 3 and 4 in the third period, and we blew it. When you look at the series for Minnesota against Vegas, is it a feeling of we should have won that series? We were right there. Is that in a positive or a negative way? What's the feel of coming out of that playoff series?
It's funny because I feel like there is a large contingent of fans that are very disappointed that the Wild didn't find a way to win the series, considering what has happened the last 2 postseason series as well. 2-1 lead against St. Louis, 2-1 lead against Dallas, and both series ended up being 6 games to the other team. I will say this playoff series felt different just because every game was back and forth and very contested, very tight, came down to little moments each time. And honestly, when Gustav Nyquist was offsides on the Ryan Hartman goal, that felt like the deciding factor in the series right there. I feel like if the Wild get that goal from Hartman that gives them enough to win that game and probably gives them enough to win the series. So it comes down to little coin flips, as we see so often in the postseason. I myself am not super upset about how that series went, considering what the Wilds were dealing with financially. If you have the ability to add one or two $7 million players to this roster, I think you win that series just fine. But the fact that they didn't have that at their disposal, you have to get production from other guys to match. And as the series went on, Eichel, Stone, they really turned it up to 11. The Wild got great series from Kirill Kaprizov and Matt Boldy, and they could not get a third or a fourth player to really step up to match. And honestly, you play that series out 100 times, Vegas maybe wins 55, 54 times. I feel like it was pretty even. It just came down to bounces that did not go Minnesota's way.
All right, well, up next, we're going to talk about the Minnesota Wild offseason. I'm guessing Kirill Kaprizov might come up in that discussion. That's next on Locked On NHL Game Night. You ever decide at the last minute you want to head to the ball game with some friends or family? Maybe it's a game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. Well, that's exactly where Gametime can help you out. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on more food, drinks, merch, or even bring a bigger group to the game with you. Gametime helps you make that possible. They help make buying tickets faster and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch. They've got incredible last minute deals. You get clear seat views when you're buying and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying tickets. Gametime is the official ticketing partner of Locked On Major League Baseball, making it easy to browse apps for exciting upcoming games. They also have exclusive last-minute tickets and zone deals to save 10% on things like FIBA Club World Cup matchups. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code Locked On NHL. You'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code Locked On NHL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, we are continuing with Seth Toupal. He is the host of Locked On Wild. Let's talk maybe a little bit about some of the offseason moves. Shu, why don't you lead us off on this one?
As far as the Minnesota Wild are concerned in terms of the offseason, I don't think it's been overly loud, so to speak. Let me know if you understand what I mean by that. It hasn't been like loud in comparison to like the other teams around the league, but it's not for the lack of movement that has stood out to me in terms of the Wild. What stood out to me is that like they went out and they acquired Brendan Gouin to the Minnesota. They traded away Brendan Gouin to the Columbus Blue Jackets, and as well as the Wild acquiring Vladimir Tarasenko. That move actually stood out to me. He was acquired from the Detroit Red Wings for future considerations, and for a team that didn't lack in the scoring department, I thought this was an interesting move because you talk about when you get to the postseason, it's about having scoring depth. And Tarasenko is a guy who can still score, even though he's getting a little long in the tooth. So my question to you is, Seth, is when the Wild acquired Vladimir Tarasenko from the Detroit Red Wings, what was your impression of the move, and as well as how do you see him being a big fit on this roster in terms of him potentially playing the role of a mentor for a guy like Kirill Kaprizov?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because Kirill, once this was something that the Wild were looking into, from the sounds of it, Kaprizov actually convinced Tarasenko to waive his no trade to come to Minnesota. And they've been friends for a while, so they talked, and Tarasenko had some questions about what things were like in Minnesota, and Kaprizov evidently eased all of his concerns, if he had any, that led to him being able to come here. And it's interesting for Tarasenko because you look at his numbers at face value last year, and he had 11 goals, not a ton in the way of points, and you may think, oh, that's not a good sign, but that Detroit team did not have a good season at all last year. They started off terrible. They ended up firing their coach. They bring in Todd McClellan, and they had a decent run for a couple of 2-3 weeks in the middle, and then they faded down the stretch. And he was on a line with two mostly defensive forwards in Detroit, which I don't think that's optimizing what he does. He'll come to Minnesota, and the expectation is that he's going to play on the second line. Now, whether that is with Matt Boldy as his opposite wing or maybe Matt Zuccarello, depending on how the top six shapes out. I think one of the biggest weaknesses for that second line last year was not having a shooter opposite of Matt Boldy. You had Matt Boldy and Joel Eriksson for large stretches of the season, and they just did not have a playmaker on the other side, and Tarasenko is a shooter first and foremost. So I think he can come in and can just give them that element for sure. He is great on the power play, whether or not he cracks the top unit or just helps give depth to the second unit. I think that'll be big as well. But you talked about, it wasn't a flashy offseason for the Minnesota Wild. I think the Wild were interested in a few pieces free agency wise, but a lot of guys just opted to stay home. A lot of guys just opted to stay where they were. A couple of guys moved teams, and, free agency is a way to, I think, add finishing touches to your roster. It's not the way to build your team. And I think Bill Guerin saw some of the sticker prices for these guys and said, we're going to have to find other ways to make this roster better. And I think Tarasenko, if he can get back to the level he was at a couple of years ago, will be a good add. If he doesn't, though, then he probably slots in lower in the lineup. Somebody else takes that spot on the second line, which also then deepens your lineup too. Because you think about if Tarasenko's on a third line and is successful there, it's a pretty deep roster all of a sudden.
Well, Kirill Kaprizov is the big story this offseason. Now he's going into the final year of a 5-year deal, paying him $9 million a year, 28 years old. Seth, it seems like there's plenty of optimism that this is going to get done. Kaprizov seems very happy there. I'm sure Minnesota will want to give him what he's worth. What is that number being talked about? Is he going to be the highest paid winger in the NHL? And do they get this done before the start of the season?
Well, it is interesting because Bill Guerin said, we want to get this done as quickly as we can. There's been good progress made, but these types of deals take a while to get done. And there's a little bit of a back and forth. Kaprizov obviously wants to be compensated for where he is in the NHL as far as the skill set goes. He's one of the best players in the league. And Craig Leopold, the Minnesota Wild's owner, has said nobody's going to offer him more money than we will. And he's not wrong about that. But some things, Eddie, that I think also help the Minnesota Wild is the new contract stipulations in the CBA. So if Kaprizov signs with the Minnesota Wilds, he can get 2 additional years on his contract compared to where he would if he elected to sign in free agency somewhere else. If he signs before July 1st of 2026, he can sign, I believe it's an 8-year deal, because players, they're allowing players to sign those longer deals before the CBA kicks in. If he waits until after July 1st of next year, max he can sign as a 6-year deal. So you think about the AAV that would have to be offered by teams trying to beat what the Wild could offer over 8 years. That's going to be a pretty big cap hit for anybody that would try to pull him in free agency. I think ultimately this gets done. I think the number is going to be in the 15s, but I think for the Minnesota Wild, yeah, there's going to be some sticker shock with that contract initially, but you pay a far heftier price if you allow him to leave, because you're going to turn away tons of fans that have bought his jerseys over the time that he has been here. If you allow him to leave, now he could come to that realization on his own, and there's not a lot you can do about that. But if you decide that it's not worth giving him what he should be paid, you're going to pay a far heftier price for that in the years down the road after. So I think this gets done. I think it'll be in the 15s, at least everything that I have seen so far. And it'll be a huge number until Connor McDavid signs his, until some of these other players sign theirs. And then next thing you know, we're barely going to be thinking about it.
Real quick, goalie Philip Gustafson and Matt Zuccarello forward are also UFAs. Certainly, Kaprizov is the priority. What about talks between those two guys?
I think the Wild need to do some work on Philip Gustafson's deal because Jesper Wallstedt did not have a great season this past year. Now, he still profiles as kind of the future goalie in waiting, but I like to have contingency plans. I like to have second options, third options. Philip Gustafson's been one of the best goalies in the league when he has been healthy and the team in front of him has been healthy as well. There's going to be a price to pay for that, but I think it's certainly worth it considering he's been, borderline top 6-7 goalie in the league statistically the last few years. So that'll probably be in the $6 or $7 million range. As far as Matt Zuccarello goes, it seems like is leaning towards this being his final season. Now, he could go the Marc-Andre Fleury route and come back for one more after this season goes if he's able to stay healthy as well. But he's kind of starting to float this being the last ride with the Minnesota Wild at least. So we'll have to see how he does and whether or not he wants to come back for maybe one more go.
All right, we'll continue to look ahead towards next season at the Minnesota Wild. We'll do that next here on Locked On NHL Game Night. All right, we're wrapping it up with the host of Locked On Minnesota Wild. He is Seth Toupal. And Seth, we're going to take a look at the Wild projected lineup. I know you talked about Tarasenko maybe being on the second line. For people that are not watching on YouTube, we'll describe this. But I did want to get your thoughts on what the lineup might look like, a projected lineup for the Minnesota Wild. A top line of Eriksson, Ek, Kaprizov, and Boldy. Rossi, Johansson, Zuccarello on the second line. Hartman, Foligno, Tarasenko third line. Sturm, Trennan, and Hinostroza on the fourth line. Your defensive pairings of Faber and Middleton, Spurgeon and Boyum, and Bogosian and Juracek, and your netminders Gustafsson and Wallstedt. You have any big issues with this? Any like battles in training camp that could see this kind of fluctuate at all? Or what are your thoughts on this projected lineup for Minnesota?
I would definitely say that I will be shocked if Marcus Johansson is playing on line 2, just because the Wild did that basically all of last season, and it just didn't work. It was not the production level that the Wild needed from a second line, and I will be very surprised if Vladimir Tarasenko isn't locking down that spot, at least in the early part of the season. Now, whether or not he fills that role for the entirety of the year remains to be seen. But at the beginning of the year, at least, I think he will get that second line wing spot with either Marco Rossi or Joel Eriksson Ek, depending on which route the Wild go for centers. As far as the rest of the lineup goes, two names that I think we'll be keeping an eye on as far as training camp goes will be Liam Ogren and Danila Yurov, potentially locking down some spots. I know Vinny Hinostroza is a kind of a hard effort fourth line player that played, I thought, pretty decently for the Minnesota Wild when he was brought in, but he does have a ceiling offensively that he can offer. So he may be somebody that starts at Iowa but can be called up if the team runs into an injury situation. I think guys like Liam Ogren and Danila Yurov will be given every opportunity to make the team, in which case they'd probably slot in as third or fourth line guys. And beyond that, I really dig the potential to have Marcus Foligno, Ryan Hartman, and whoever that third wing ends up being. I really dig what that line could potentially do as a third line. So it's going to be interesting. They obviously have the young defenseman in, and Zeev Boyum and David Juracek penciled in for time on defense. So their learning curve is going to be one that happens very quickly. But I think it's going to be real interesting to see how this team does compared to the rest of the Central, in which it seemed like many of the Central Division teams were in a similar situation to where the Minnesota Wild are at, where they're kind of counting pennies and trying to make moves while also operating pretty close to the cap themselves.
Speaking of the Central Division, because I was actually I was thinking about this as you were talking. I was like, right now the Central Division is stacked. I mean, right now I think it's fair to say that Winnipeg is favored to win the division, right? But after Winnipeg, though, I take into consideration Dallas, Colorado, St. Louis, and then there's Minnesota. Based on the moves that you've seen so far this offseason, where do you project the Minnesota Wild finishing in the division? Do you see them finishing within top 3 of the division, or do you foresee them being a wild card team in the West?
I think the Wild have a good chance to get the 3rd spot in the Central once again this year. Last year, if they don't have just the rash of injuries that they suffered, I think they honestly probably would have been one of the top 3 in the Central, but things just kind of fell apart there for a 4 or 5 week stretch, and that ended up costing them that spot. This year, I think one of those top 3 teams is going to have a lesser year than they had last year. I think if the Wild can if they can stay relatively healthy, even if they can be like 70% healthy, I think that'll be enough for them to get one of the top spots in the Central. But you're dead on. I think Winnipeg they're the leader in the clubhouse until proven otherwise. Colorado's still very dangerous. Dallas is still very dangerous, but they've also got some flaws on those rosters. So if the Wilds can stay healthy and if they can get some good production from some of those guys that are getting up there a little bit, especially Vladimir Tarasenko, if he comes in and he looks really good, that solves so many problems for this team from a scoring standpoint. So if they can just get a little more even production, a little better production, and if they get more than 41 games from Kirill Kaprizov, I think they're going to be just fine.
Bill Guerin's going into, I believe, his 6th season as general manager. John Hynes in his 3rd season as head coach. How secure are those men in their positions?
Well, that's interesting because I think if the Wild miss the postseason this year because of the situation with Kirill Kaprizov, and I think the Wild are just trying to be very, very cautious with that. But if you have a season where things kind of unravel and fall apart, there could be some hot seats in Minnesota. I think if they make the playoffs, if they take a little bit of a stride this year, I think everybody's fine. But if they struggle, and this is a team that's kind of on the bubble and maybe misses out by a game or two on the playoffs, I could see the temperature getting cranked up on Bill Guerin's seat and John Hynes. Now, is it enough for them to be booted? Probably not, but I could see at least the temperature starting to rise a little bit.
So when you talk about the Minnesota Wild, the young players that are developing in the years that they've had, I talked about it earlier on in the first segment, but one player in particular that really stood out to me was Zeev Bayam. And like this is one of the better young defensemen that is developing as we continue to watch him play in the NHL. So my question to you, Seth, is what have you seen from Bayam that has made you so excited and optimistic in terms of his development, in terms of becoming ultimately a top 4 defenseman, a position in which currently Jared Spurgeon, the captain, currently is in right now?
Well, I think for one, his skating is very impressive. He is a smooth skater. He glides when he's on the ice. He's also very good with handling the puck, making quick decisions, and making impact plays offensively. Defensively is where his game is going to need a little work, and we did see that against Vegas in the playoffs. He started the series against Vegas. He did not finish the series against Vegas, but with young players and a guy who was 19 when he was was playing, you expect there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. We don't get every player that just comes to the NHL and immediately does like Brock Faber did, where he starts and then you just that's it. Like it takes some guys a little bit of time to figure out what it takes to win at this level. So he's a quick study, though, and the fact that he did what he did at Denver, he's a guy that knows what it takes to win. And there is something to be said about knowing what it takes and what winning looks like. His offense is going to be what pulls him through the early part of his career, but as he makes strides defensively, he's going to be a very fun player to watch for this team. And honestly, give it maybe a year, and I think the light bulb will come on, and he's just going to hit the runway and just go with it.
All right, that is Seth Toupal. He is our local expert for the Minnesota Wild. If you are a Wild fan, you need to subscribe and check out Locked On Wild for all the best news and opinions on this team during the offseason, during the season, as the Minnesota Wild will be opening up next season, October 9th in St. Louis. We're already counting down the days towards next season. Seth, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing some of your insights on the Minnesota Wild for this past season and the upcoming season.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you.
All right. And that will do it for this edition of this offseason edition of Locked On NHL Game Night. If you have thoughts, if you're watching on YouTube, want to share your thoughts in the comments section about what's going on with the Minnesota Wild, please do so. And of course, please like and subscribe as well. Shu and I, along with our friends Cam Stewart and Tyler Feldman, are going to be continuing to give you these offseason looks at all 32 teams leading up to the 2025-2026 season. If you missed any of these offseason previews, you can also check them out wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. I'm Eddie Garcia. He's Shukri Wrights. Thank you for listening and watching Locked On NHL Game Night, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your teams every day.